Hey, welcome to the Art Project Podcast. We're talking with artists about their current projects, their past works, and everything in between. This is your host, Camila Moreiras. We are joined today by Grammy-nominated pianist Chris Pattishall. Thank you so much for coming on the show. What a pleasure.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to chatting.
To start off, it feels so incomplete to even introduce you as a pianist. You have your hands dipped in so many different components of music making, and the references you draw from are vast. Everything from literature to film to architecture to nature, but also in terms of genre. You are heavily rooted in jazz, but pull from electronic, classical, gospel, hip-hop, tango, klezmer. I mean, you really view music holistically in a lot of ways. Before we get into some of the more recent projects that you've been engaged in, I was hoping you could help situate our listeners on how you come to understand music from a place of experimentation and historical respect.
My primary sort of avenue of becoming a musician was very much through jazz music. I was very lucky that I had some teachers and mentors very early who encouraged me and showed me how to go about making the music, how to go about learning the music, and also introducing me to community and having music making be an active thing that I was doing outside of something that was just a class in school. That experience in particular, I think, really inspired me to pursue it. It felt like from the time I was in high school, I was working professionally, and I was so excited to go and make music with different people in different contexts, get paid for it, and to feel like I was doing something that was part of a musician's community and a community of people listening and enjoying live music events. When I think back early on, hearing Thelonious Monk was a very pivotal moment for me. And there was something about what he was playing that was clearly deeply rooted in the blues, deeply rooted in gospel music, deeply rooted in jazz. There was something that felt very grounded and something that reached back many generations.
Did you have this kind of visceral gut feeling that, oh, this is something that I'm really drawn to?
Well, there were pieces that I recognized, and my pathway into jazz, I'd had a teacher that had taught me some very simple blues piano arrangements. That was kind of the precursor to getting into playing jazz. But the flip side was that while Monk was doing that, he was also creating these sounds on the piano that were very mysterious and sounded like they transcended the physical possibilities of the instrument. It sounded like he was making the piano sound broken or distorted or surreal, while also being very grounded in a deep and recognizable tradition. I wouldn't say that at 11 or 12, I was thinking about it in those terms, but I was very drawn to it. And that's a way of just also saying that I've always been interested in how music works, within various traditions. So what is it that makes tango music work in a certain way, whereas in jazz it works a different way? What are the internal mechanics? What are the techniques? What are the priorities? And I've always been drawn to sounds that were mysterious and that I did not know how they were made, how one could even go about thinking about it. That sense of the unknown and of discovery has motivated me just as much.
How do you go about exploring all the things that make up a sound? I mean, I know that music theory has been a big part of your upbringing and education as a musician, although even that concept of music theory, I think, can be pretty abstract for non-musicians. How do you go from the academic study of music theory to exploring, okay, this is really what makes a sound. This is how people can put it together. This is what makes tango tango and jazz or.
Yeah, I was very lucky that it was instilled in me early. And I think this is a big part of the jazz tradition, but also gospel. A lot of African American music forms are communicated primarily orally. It's not something that you are learning and developing from sheet music. And of course, there's a lot of sheet music and it has its use. But from the beginning, I was learning to use my ears to learn. And that I think continues to influence me in that I view music as something that is primarily an oral experience. It starts there. It is not a cerebral experience or even an emotional experience initially. The first thing that happens is that there's sound pressure and there are waves and there's stuff going on that your brain is processing. And the technique of learning things by ear has opened up everything for me through the years, whether it was learning, the earliest examples would have been transcribing improvised solos by jazz musicians. That then expanded into being able to sit and listen to a solo piano piece by Art Tatum or Mary Lou Williams and not be intimidated to say, okay, how can I figure out what they're playing with all 10 fingers in both hands? Technology has been very helpful with that. There's a lot of software that allows you to loop things or slow things down. And I don't understand how people did it when they were just listening to records on vinyl. That's like baffles me. But using my ear is the primary way that I go about learning music. And whether that is decoding melody, harmony, rhythm within a stylistic context, or whether it is listening to the frequencies and in a more technical capacity. I will say also that relatively early on, I realized that one of the things that I really loved about hip hop in particular was the way that the music sounded. So it wasn't just, oh, I like the energy of the drums and I like the energy of whoever's rapping, but wow, there's something about the way that the piano sounds or the way that this, whatever instrument, and realizing that in many cases, those were sampled recordings, that the recording had been recorded in some sort of way, had been cut to vinyl. That vinyl had been sampled into a digital sampler. You know, there are all these layers that each kind of add some residue or some aura to the sound. And a lot of my favorite hip hop producers exploit that in all kinds of creative ways.
I know Common has been a big influence on you, or at least he used to be.
Yeah, I mean, Common, Like Water for Chocolate, that album, and also D'Angelo's Voodoo, they came out right around the same time. And both of those albums, they're deeply studied in a way in terms of dealing with various cultural practices, whether it's incorporating R&B, gospel, jazz. The feeling of the music owes so much to that. There's also a tremendous amount of experimentation, and I think also just the way the albums sound, who mixed them, who mastered them. In the case of the Common record in particular, Jay Dilla produced quite a bit of that, and Russell Elevado mixed about half of the record. Bob Power mixed the other half. And I went back recently and listened, and I can hear a clear differentiation between the songs that Bob mixed and the songs that Russell mixed. But Dilla always is like, there's so much of this sort of aura and residue and also sense of mystery in what he produced.
I love this idea and this sense of residue meeting aura, because the only way to innovate is to take the past with you, I think. And then that can grow into, everything.
Yeah.
I did want to say, so you spent a few years essentially creating a masterful interpretation commissioned by the Catskill Jazz Factory. It was also the recipient of the 2019 Aaron Copland Fund Recording Grant. And you did this masterful interpretation of Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges's fictions. It's an interpretation both in the sense of it being a kind of genre adaptation of the collection, literary to musical, but also, and in my mind most importantly, it's in the sense of sitting with each story and letting it speak to you. As the listeners, we get to hear that conversation that's, I imagine, is first happening in your head, and then how that translates onto the page. Thinking about translation, I'm pretty sure you read fictions in English, so there is already translation that's happening. So it's sort of a translation in double time, which I think, going back to this idea of aura and residue, those things really make a mark in terms of how you are creating this new story. So I suppose in continuing the conversation, how does a project like this get built? But in general, just to expand on the use of genre.
Yeah, someone recommended the short stories of Borges to me, and I fell in love immediately. There is, again, something in his writing that is deeply studied and sort of exhaustive in its almost like cataloging of what has come before. And yet he found such a brilliant, unique way of relaying the information, sort of inventing a new genre in how he went about doing that. So for a long time, I was just reading the stories and loving them and being inspired and having this sense of vertigo almost, or like you're looking into an infinity mirror or something in a very heady way, but also a lot of humor. Yeah, the way he could be mystical and down to earth and mysterious and almost clinical all at once blows my mind. So I was doing a number of projects with the Catskill Jazz Factory, which was functioning as kind of an incubator for younger artists. And the producer, organizer called me and he said he wanted to do a concert and he wanted no drums. He was just like, that's the only condition, is no drums. And it occurred to me that tango music, a lot of people tend to jump to Piazzolla. I'm thinking 1920s and 30s golden era is such a robust music rhythmically with no drums and really no percussion at all. And just the way that piano, bass, guitar, violin, bandoneon can create rhythm, like an energy that has momentum and moves you forward, and then also to like stretch out and become very lyrical and romantic. I was like, I would love to do something like that. And then I thought about these stories, and it occurred to me that sort of writing a short piece for each story felt really exciting. And I liked the idea that they would be little vignettes. I was not in any way trying to score the story. I wasn't trying to give the listener a sense of here's what happens in the plot, but to try and conjure a mood. And I spent a lot of time doing a lot of research, a lot of studying old recordings, grabbing all of these little cells or little ideas from different recordings. Oh, I really love how this texture works, or I love this rhythm. And then I was also thinking a lot about the way that Borges's writing references so many different things, whether it's history, politics, literature, theology. It's like he's able to draw from such a broad range and do it in this very subtle, understated way. And so there's a lot of stuff in the music where I'm doing similar stuff, whether it's folk music of Argentina, whether it's works by Stravinsky, whether it's, there's one piece for the story, The Secret Miracle, where a man is set to be executed in the morning and he's in prison, and at night he hears, if I remember correctly, Borges does specifically mention it's a Hungarian folk melody. And I found in a collection of Bartók a piece that the lyrics are about being in prison. And so that melody then became this thing that sort of echoes in the background of that particular movement. So there's a lot of meta textual information that I don't think any listener is going to hear. But that was what sort of grounded my approach.
I love that. And I also love the contrast between the expansiveness, the infinity, as you say, of Borges's writing with the constraint of not being able to use drums at the Catskill Jazz Factory. I think that that's pretty beautiful, especially because that constraint allowed you to be equally expansive in every other way.
Yeah, I'm particularly happy with how I used that constraint as an opportunity. And I wish that I was able to do that in every circumstance where there's a constraint. It turned out really well. And I just have to say this because I would be remiss if I didn't. There's a composer and pianist in Argentina that I just absolutely love, named Diego Schisi. And he is now contemporarily writing just so much beautiful music for a setting of piano, violin, guitar, bandoneon, and bass. And of the contemporary music that I've heard, I just continue to be stunned by him and draw a tremendous amount of inspiration.
Well, maybe you'll have to reach out and do a collaboration with him.
Actually, so in maybe 2021, when things were still shut down, we did do a version of Fictions where it wasn't a live performance, we just live streamed it. And I got several people to record themselves reading not the entirety of a short story, but excerpts. And I reached out to Diego. We'd been in touch at various points, but he agreed to read an excerpt of, I think it was The Library of Babel. And he was the only person that read it in Spanish. Everyone else was English, but just the sound and the tone and the cadence of hearing it read in Spanish by an Argentinian, it was like, wow, this is the thing, you know?
Oh, man. Was Fictions the start of your collaboration with vocalist Vuyo Sotashe?
No. Actually, Vuyo and we met. I was doing a lot of work at Jazz at Lincoln Center. This was in the time where I was basically only working as a jazz pianist, as a side musician for different gigs. And Vuyo was working as an intern in the admin side. And I went and played a concert at William Patterson where I got my master's. And I was introduced to him. He was a student there. And the head of the program said, "Oh, you got to hear this guy sing." And it was maybe a year or two before I heard him sing. And then it was just like total life-changing moment. And we've been working together, I mean, at least 10 years now.
So I wanted to play an excerpt from your debut single as a duo, They Say I Look Like God, a song originally written by the Brubecks and sung by Louis Armstrong. The emotion is raw and haunting, but it is also a spiritual cry.
They say I look like God. Could God be black? My God, if all are made in the image of thee, could thou perchance a zebra be? Can it be? No, not he.
So just for context, we recorded this in, I think it was October of 2020.
A few months after George Floyd's killing.
Yeah, exactly. And we were very concerned about what was and has been and continues to go on in this country in terms of disproportionate amounts of state violence towards people of color. We were worried about what was coming up in the election. And the way that the recording came about is I was supposed to do a show at Duke University that had to be canceled because of COVID. And they gave me the opportunity to do a pre-recorded film video concert thing that would then be streamed at a certain moment. So I reached out to Vuyo, and it is a song that both of us had performed previously. The history of the piece, the Brubecks wrote a jazz musical called The Real Ambassadors. And this would have been in the early 60s, where a lot of American jazz musicians were being sent abroad by the U.S. State Department as sort of a goodwill, soft power endeavor. And the Brubecks, in their piece, The Real Ambassadors, were pointing out the hypocrisy of the U.S. State Department to send Black American jazz musicians abroad to extol the virtues of American democracy and the American way of life, while domestically there was such intense violence, repression, disenfranchisement. And the piece, They Say I Look Like God, from my understanding, the Brubecks originally wanted it to be a sort of tongue-in-cheek satirical performance. And Louis Armstrong sings it with such depth and gravitas and ache that it kind of transformed the meaning of the piece for them, for everybody. So fall 2020, we both felt a calling to include that piece, to stake out a position and advocate within what we do as musicians.
Uh-huh. Is this work that's continuing for you too?
Vuyo and I, we're preparing a bunch of stuff. We have an EP that will come out at some point in the near future. The majority of the music that we make is not maybe quite as explicit. I think that both of us would say that underlying motivation is consistently there. And whether we are choosing to do that in a song like They Say I Look Like God, there's some songs that we play that in a way are affirmations of the value of love and of acceptance. And that is still very much connected. That is positing the utopian outcome that we would hope for. So I would say that by and large, that is a piece of what it is that we're doing, whether it's explicitly stated in the subject matter of the song or not.
I love that you bring up the concept of love. As cliche as it might sound, the concept of love is always all-encompassing. And that through line, I think, is also very prevalent in the work of a friend and collaborator of yours, Samora Pinder-Hughes. And so kind of to tie that into your sense of your musical family and collaboration, I wanted to touch on pre-COVID lockdowns. There was Chris the Performer. And then there was this explosion of broadening that came out of not being able to perform at all during that time. We're in 2024 right now. So in the 4 years since, you released an incredible debut album called Zodiac, a reimagining of Mary Lou Williams' Zodiac Suite. You produced a fantastic record for trumpist Riley Mulherkar alongside Rafik Bhatia, another longtime friend and collaborator. You co-composed the scores for the Emmy-winning documentary Going to Mars, a Nikki Giovanni project. Congratulations, by the way. That's a newly minted Emmy.
Thank you.
And The Strike, which is due to be released on PBS next year with Samora Pinder-Hughes. You also contributed to the film scores for Knives Out, Nightmare Alley, and the multi-Oscar winning Everything Everywhere All at Once. On a smaller scale, you're also writing the music for my latest documentary, Eleki, which hopefully will wrap up in the next month.
Nice.
So that's just an incredible amount of production and at such a high caliber. I know for you, collaboration really is just paramount. So within the conversation that we've been having, I'm curious about your personal philosophy surrounding collaboration. Probably there's a million answers to that depending on the million projects that you're working on, but taking collaboration as a jumping off point, how does it influence how you see yourself as a musician and engage with these projects, but also just building up this musical family, as it were?
Yeah, I would say that collaboration is probably the most important piece of my experience as a musician, artist, whatever. I am very lucky to be able to spend time and make work with folks that inspire me and push me and that I also just have fun with. And over the last several years, I've grown into a place of feeling comfortable in myself with a recognition that I think collaboration is one of the things that I do really well. I think that I am empathetic and sensitive and open-minded, and I enjoy getting to make music in a lot of different ways. I remember even back in the time when I was sort of just working as a pianist in live performance contexts, sometimes when it was my turn to take a solo, I would feel a heightened sense of self-criticism, or I would just feel nervous. I would be worried about whether or not I was going to play a sufficiently impressive thing. That kind of goes down another pathway, which is like got a lot to do with ego and how we validate ourselves as artists. and where I was maybe had an unhealthy balance at that time. But I do remember even then feeling way more comfortable, way more creative and spontaneous when I was accompanying other people. And that is a form of collaboration. I'm listening to what someone else is doing. I'm giving it my best shot at trying to support and lift and develop and enhance whatever someone else is doing. And I love the creative act of doing that. And I also love the emotional feeling of making that kind of connection with someone else, of being inspired by someone, then doing something that inspires them more, that we're able to build something greater than what any of us would do in isolation. The regular collaborators I have, folks like Rafik Bhatia, Samora Penderhughes, Vuyo Sotashe, Riley Mulherkar, also visual artist Kembui Olujimi that I've scored a number of projects for. I'm always learning something. I'm always feeling inspired by something new. And I think I'm also providing that for them as well. And the scoring work I've done with Samora has just been, it's kind of amazing how well we work together and how we can get on a similar wavelength and be focused in the same way, but then also bring dramatically different perspectives and information and ideas to the table, and then synthesize those together super fluidly, super fast, and with like no ego.
Do you feel like these works, especially as a composer and as a producer, do you see that as a continuation of where you started as a piano performer, a jazz performer? Or do you see this almost as a consequence of this imposed stoppage of performing during the COVID lockdowns?
I think I made a lot of progress on this front during COVID. When I look back over the course of my life, early on, I was very, very lucky to be encouraged and mentored, and relatively quickly was kind of like a precocious talent. I would definitely not say child prodigy, but was very good and outstanding in my peer group. And right around the time that, I was getting into middle school and high school, and there was all of this social development happening, the affirmation and accolades and all of this sort of positive stuff that I was receiving became a crutch in my sense of self-worth and ego, and continued to basically take an outsized portion of who I viewed myself as, how I valued myself, to the point where in the years leading up to 2020, I had been experiencing a tremendous amount of internal angst and pressure and perpetual discontentment. If I had been out on a long tour and I got back to New York and had a week off, and I got on Instagram and saw, well, this person's in Italy and this person's in Japan and this person just played Carnegie Hall, it's like all of a sudden I would just sink into the deepest depression and just be like, oh, my career is over and I'm just worthless. And I started going to therapy in like May 2018. And that started to unlock some stuff for me. But it really was 2020 when I had a schedule for the full year of things I was going to do, concerts and tours and this and that and the other. And it all just evaporated. And I was not sure. I don't think any of us knew quite exactly what was going to happen. And I was confronted with the thought that, okay, if being a musician is not an option anymore, how am I going to find happiness, sort of period? Because if I'm being honest, the career self-worth piece was still taking up the majority of my space. And so it gave me an opportunity to step back. Also, nobody had gigs, so nobody was posting about their gigs on social media,
That helped.
you know? Yeah. And just saying, okay, very simple stuff. Like, here's my family. Here's my, at the time, girlfriend. Here's my new dog. Here's like a beautiful spring day in May. I like these things. These things make me happy. I like the cheeseburger at King's in Durham. That makes me happy, you know? Basically kind of slowly rebuilding in a way that was not dependent on external validation. What do other people think of me? What is my like speculative value on the jazz scene? Like, am I a hot commodity or not? Do people like what I'm playing? All of this stuff that I had developed, I think, a pretty unhealthy relationship with. I was able to do like a long soak and let the scabs soften and release, you know?
I think about child actors, right? And this is very similar to what they have to undo because they are in the public eye. And you might not call yourself a child prodigy, but a lot of people certainly place that label on you when you were a child. And that does carry a lot of weight and a lot of responsibility when we're just simply too young for it. What's so beautiful about your musical family is that whether it be this shared moment through COVID where nobody was able to perform or just the collective grief of that time period. And but also thinking, you know, the people we've mentioned, you included, identify as male. And whether it be a sense of collective grief, you all are also incredibly vulnerable and happy to be vulnerable, happy to show an emotional side to yourselves through your work. And just in terms of how I think you guys are sort of just approaching being a human being and being an artist and just kind of going through this world. And I kind of love that. I forget the name of Samora's latest record, Venus Cries Not in the House of the Sun.
Of tears. Yeah.
I don't even know if it's released yet. It might be releasing in October, but he's got a couple singles out. And those two songs that I've listened to, I feel are very much connected to mental health. I suspect maybe some epilepsy, but I don't know. I'll leave that for other folks to interpret. There's a lot that we can take from the past, right? The residue, the aura, but we can't take it all. And needing to shed these elements of guarding, of isolation, of toxicity, and opening up a path to understand ourselves collectively and individually through love is the only way to move through grief. I applaud all of you for paving the way for us because I think it helps the masses immensely.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, Samora, I think, is just incredible in how vulnerable he is able to be, in particular in his art on the records and in live performance, and in how he's able to conjure those feelings in music and to put words to it in the lyrics. And he continues to be an inspiration in that way. I'm very lucky, but I'm surrounded by people that are gentle and generous and open and loving and patient. And that allows me to continue to be in that sort of space. I find that just being in that sort of place is a much better way of building community in general.
And I think that that honesty really shows through in the music that you make and the projects that you do. I did want to just pick your brain a little bit about your record, Zodiac, because so Mary Lou Williams' Zodiac Suite is only piano, correct?
For the most part, there is bass and drums. There's a recording she made in 1945 that is mostly solo piano with some bass and drums. There are several other iterations, and some of the movements pop up in other contexts through the years. She wrote arrangements of some of the movements for the Dizzy Gillespie Big Band. There's an Oscar Pettiford record. He's a jazz bassist. Some of her movements show up on that. But the main recording that I fell in love with, yeah, it's mostly solo piano.
Okay. So how do you take that? I mean, thinking through this concept of honesty and vulnerability, why did you want to reimagine Zodiac Suite?
I had known about Mary Lou Williams in a very abstract kind of like footnote in jazz history way, partially because she spent the last couple years of her life as artist in residence at Duke University. And I knew in a kind of academic sense, oh, she was very important to the development of certain moments in the history of the music, writing for big band in the swing era, the development of bebop. She wrote a lot for Duke Ellington. I kind of knew it, but I hadn't really spent time with her music. And I heard a performance of the movement Cancer, not by her, by someone else. And just the song kind of blew me away. And I decided to go back and listen to the album and really just fell in love. Again, there was a sense of groundedness, a kind of masterful deployment of genre, if you will, and incredible curiosity and embracing of the unknown, of trying something new. I also heard it through the filter of one of my mentors, Marcus Roberts, who was very closely associated with Wynton Marsalis, who both of them have investigated historical style and genre in a variety of ways. And in Marcus's case, had created several suites of music that combined kind of through composed material with opportunities for whatever the ensemble was to play and improvise. For a long time, I was just listening to the music. I started learning it by ear off the record. I started writing down little pieces of it. And actually, the thing that spawned this as an actual piece that I perform is my friend Aaron Deal, who's an incredible pianist that I admire tremendously, was serving as the artistic director for the Catskill Jazz Factory in its inaugural year. And he asked me to put something together and to bring a group up, rehearse for a number of days, give a concert. And I was like, oh, let's do Zodiac Suite. And we only played maybe 3 movements of it, but that set me up in a way. It also, just by virtue of who I called, which they were all very good friends of mine from Florida State, Alfonso Horn on trumpet, Ricardo Pascal on tenor saxophone, Barry Stevenson on bass, and Jameson Ross on drums, that also sort of set the instrumentation, which as I worked through the rest of the suite, I was always kind of using that as the grounding point. We performed it at Dizzy's in the fall of 2012 and again in 2014. I've tried it out with different musicians through the years in performances at Trinity Wall Street, at National Sawdust, all venues in New York. And I will say that in the way that I arranged it, in terms of just what is the band playing, it's very faithful to the Mary Lou Williams recording. There are definitely things that we do that didn't happen on the record, or there are things that we do a little bit differently. But a big majority of what we played is very true to what Mary Lou played on this recording. Where Rafik Bhatia came in and was so transformative, both in terms of how we recorded the music and in how we treated those recordings and mixed and produced it in post. We were really, again, fixated on this idea of residue and aura and of like creating something spectral that feels like it's emerging from the music. And if you look at it in a historical framework, it's our way of paying homage to the residue of the original recordings. You know, it's like it was recorded to tape and then cut to vinyl. And how was reverb created in the 40s? What sort of mics were they using? how do those things color what we're actually hearing? And I think in the best moments, we're very successful at having it at once be this almost very studied historical genre specific thing. And at other moments, something is peeking through or emerging from the texture and feels like something completely unexpected and different.
Well, I mean, along with that, what I have always found very inspiring from you, you can go from something so studied and the historical, like how reverb became, to really leaning into digital plugins and moving the digital realm further and further into the future, which I think is just great because I'm just so hesitant to do that myself. And I don't say that with a pat on the back. I mean, it's something I need to get over. But you and Rafiq produced Riley Mulherkar's newest record. These innovative moments of using the technology that you have in front of you, you and Rafiq are very drawn to nature in that sense. I don't know, maybe we can call it analog for now, for lack of a better word. So how do you put all of these things together and create a sound that is fitting for, in this case, Riley?
I think with Riley's album...
What's the name of it, by the way?
Riley Mulherkar's album, Riley. The starting point for us was just the sound that Riley gets out of the trumpet. And several things that he does that feel very unique, some of which are actually very closely related to things that are part of the jazz tradition, things that trumpet players have been doing for 100 years, certainly more, but the recorded history is almost exactly 100 years. But he has what I think is a very personal way of employing manipulations of the tone that sound very striking and arresting. And oftentimes the most arresting moments are actually the most intimate, quiet things that he does, which, because so frequently the trumpet is utilized as like a big, loud, bombastic instrument. I think Rafiq and I both were very fascinated with how gorgeous it sounds when it's really quiet and it's really intimate and you hear the breath coming through the horn. So we spent a long time on the album, but the very first session we did was Riley and I playing duos, and then Riley recording a bunch of solo trumpet. There's a piece that is the very first song on the album, Chicken Coop Blues, that is a performance of just trumpet and Riley tapping his foot, and that's it. And even in the live performances, people aren't expecting that. I think so often, especially with the attention span that a lot of audiences have these days, it's like hit them over the head immediately and then just keep hitting them. And this is like the total opposite. It's like it just pulls you in. It's like when someone is whispering or talking so quietly that you lean in to hear them better. We also recorded a lot of extended techniques. We would just say, okay, now try doing this thing, but do it in the lowest note of the horn. Now do it here or there. We recorded all of those very meticulously at a very high sample rate and like just made sure that we had a lot of material to work with. So throughout the record, there's a lot of things where we're manipulating either those samples or other things that either Riley or myself or anyone in the band performed. But we were always driven first and foremost by being attracted to this sound, this kind of very intimate, very breathy, very, what I think is very personal sound that Riley has. And there's a lot of stuff that we did digitally. There's a lot of stuff that happened totally analog. Analog is also slightly a misnomer because anything that gets recorded these days, for the most part, is going through a computer as it's being recorded. I mean, some people will record direct to tape, but they're almost always also recording to the computer as well. it does have significant advantages in terms of editing and recall. And there's things that digital handles very well. But I can tell you, like, there were a lot of things that we recorded, manipulated digitally, went back into the studio and played back through amplifiers, whether they're guitar amps or bass amps or various things, re-recorded that, brought that back into the recording session. There is a lot of, within the record itself, material that has gone through various iterations and has accrued its own residue, if you will. And that, I think for Rafik and I, the result is something that feels new, at least to us. There's a sensory experience that happens that most jazz albums that are made now definitely don't happen. There are a lot of albums that are being made in other genres that are employing these kinds of techniques. I think as we develop what we're doing together, we're also able to find ways of using those techniques in a situation that allows an improvising musician to improvise, which that is really, for me, so exciting.
I love that. Well, what's next on the docket for you? Where can people go and listen to you play? What can people expect to be released in the near future?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, Vuyo and I are working on a duo EP. We have not set a release date for that yet, but that will be sometime early next year. There is another album, which I don't think I can say. I don't think I'm allowed to publicly announce it yet because it hasn't been announced, but there's another EP duo project that will be coming out early next year that I think is sounding really amazing, and I'm very excited for everybody to hear. Samora and I recently finished a documentary film short. I'm not really sure when and where that will be shown.
This is The Strike.
No, this is a different one. The Strike will be on PBS at the end of April. And that's a very powerful film. We didn't really talk about it, but it is a documentary about a hunger strike in the California prison system in which 30,000 inmates coordinated a hunger strike together across multiple prisons in the state to protest and ultimately change California's policy about solitary confinement. Honestly, this fall, I'm traveling. I will be on tour in the US with an incredible vocalist named Ganavia. I am performing with Samora in October, and in November we'll be in Europe. Got shows coming up with Riley Mulherkar, another band that I work with, Bria Skonberg, excellent trumpet player and vocalist. I'm touring with her as well. So really, like, the next 2.5 months, I'm on the road. I can say also, Vuyo and I are doing a program of South African music with an awesome string ensemble called Palaver. And I'm working kind of slowly but surely on another album of my own. So yeah, there's a bunch of stuff in the works.
Well, we wouldn't expect anything less than that. I'll say that I'll link as much as possible in the show notes. So maybe they can go there, check out your website, sign up for your newsletter, which you release quarterly. And I love it. I'm here for the journey. Wonderful to see what you're up to. Always a huge fan. Much love. And thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.